Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, the third instalment in our Sister City Challenges series. It's wonderful to have you with us, wherever in the world you're joining from. Today, we turn our focus to a topic that touches every aspect of our daily lives, energy and transport. It's timely, it's urgent, and it's something both our communities, Queenstown and Aspen, are grappling with in very real ways. As Sarah said, I'm Sharon Fifield, Chief Executive of the Queenstown Business Chamber of Commerce, and I'm stepping in today for my counterpart, Debbie Braun, President of the Aspen Chamber, who always brings such rich perspective and passion to these conversations, especially after her recent visit to Queenstown. Just over a year ago now, we had the privilege of welcoming civic leaders from Aspen to Queenstown. Together with Destination Queenstown, Queenstown Lakes District Council, and the Aspen Institute, we got stuck into shared challenges: housing, workforce pressures, climate change, and of course, the pressing issues surrounding energy and transport. That exchange sparked ideas, built connections, and reminded us that although we sit on opposite sides of the globe, the pressures we face are strikingly similar. Here in Queenstown, we're navigating the growing pains of rapid population growth and the constant demands of our appeal as a popular visitor destination, challenges that stretch our transport systems and energy infrastructure to their limits, all of which are very familiar to our friends in Aspen, as well as, of course, our shared mountain geography, which in itself presents challenges with regards to energy and transport. Just this week, we were all reminded of the fragility of these systems. The massive power outage across Spain and Portugal cut electricity to tens of millions of people and brought transport, businesses, and everyday life to a sudden halt. It was a sobering reminder of how fragile our energy systems can be and why energy security and resilience are not just buzzwords, they're necessities. But on a positive note, today is not just about naming the problems. What I love about this ongoing series is it helps us pause, take a moment, and look outwards for a transfer of knowledge. It's about continuing to share ideas and learning from those on the front lines. Today, we'll be hearing from leaders who are working on bold solutions, from future-ready public transport to the shift to renewable energy and designing more resilient mountain towns. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists who bring experience and creativity from both sides of the world. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in to join us today. Let's get started. It's now my pleasure to introduce our brilliant moderator, Christine Maiden-Sharp from the Aspen Institute of New Zealand, who will guide us through today's discussion. Over to you, Christine.
Sharon, what a terrific introduction, and I'm honoured to be here today. It is a real pleasure to take this to this next chapter in our Sister City collaboration, this time focused on energy and transport solutions that shape the future of Aspen and Queenstown. And for those of you who don't know, the Aspen Institute is part of Aspen, Colorado's DNA, and this year we're celebrating our 75th anniversary. I lead the Institute in New Zealand, based in Queenstown, where we're focused on non-partisan, that's very important, conversations that tackle complex challenges to deliver better outcomes across generations. So we have a very long-term focus. Today, we have a great panel bringing both public and private sector perspectives. And let me introduce them now. From Aspen, Colorado, we have David Pesnicek. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority. Kara Silbernagel, Deputy County Manager at Pitkin County. And from Queenstown, Glenn Sowery, Chief Executive of Queenstown Airport, and Stephen Batstone, Founding Director at Whiteboard Energy. We'll be talking for about 40 minutes, then opening the floor to your questions. So feel free to drop those into the chat at any time. So let's begin with a short question for all four panelists. And I'll give the order. We'll start off with Aspen, David and Kara, followed by Queenstown representatives Glenn and Stephen. What's the biggest current pressure your town is facing when it comes to transport and energy? And what principle is guiding your response? Is it resilience, affordability, sustainability, perhaps equity? And when you have competing challenges, how do you assess these? Over to you, David.
Well, thanks a lot, Christine. I'm David Peasantchuk with the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority. I'd say on our end, it's worth noting our mission statement first, that it is to connect our region with transit and trails. So I think it's worth noting that our scope is beyond just transit services. So we are a full transportation authority that hits transit. We do trails, we do first last mile mobility. So we strive to be that full transportation package for our customers. But I would say that our number one challenge, and it's really coming to a head right now, is a constantly changing environment. And this really increases uncertainty for our customers, as well as uncertainty in terms of our business practices around providing our transportation services and the energy that we utilize to do that. So that really hits on a number of different pieces, certainly politically, and that's local and national, economic, as well as demographic shifts. The guiding principles that we use to really try to navigate this is, I would say, is resilience. We really strive to provide a stable and reliable transportation system and network for our customers, regardless of what's happening at the national level or within the political level. So we strive to be that service that people can count on to both get to work and have tourist activities and really stimulate the economies throughout our region.
David, Cara.
Thank you, and happy to be here, Christine. As Christine said, I'm Cara Silbernagel. I'm the Deputy County Manager here in Pitkin County. For those of you that don't know, Aspen is the county seat, but we also represent a larger region that covers both an urban place as well as the rural, and as Sharon alluded to in the intro, also just the special mountainous elements that make our respective communities so valuable for people to come visit and want to live. So as we think about transportation and energy and what are those big, large pressures that we're feeling, it really comes down to a couple elements. We are really looking at not only the congestion and what that feels like for our everyday residents, our workers, and our visitors, but we're also thinking about it as it relates to aging infrastructure and really how it impacts people's day-to-day lives and the affordability, the concepts of who gets to come in, who is within the areas, and the ease of mobility around it all, while really maintaining that this is a place and a community that's existed for so long that we want to make sure it's a community for future generations. So in 2023, we actually implemented a large community process that actually shaped a visioning for our community that took the vision statement of with climate change today, it's implementing bold climate action while balancing the economy, preserving our rural and wildlands, and supporting an equitable and affordable economy. So, as you alluded to, what are the principles and how do we balance it? That's exactly what we're looking at right now, that you can't look at one without looking at all these principles to really find what's the place for all members of our community to be able to access and make sure it's here for future generations.
Said Glenn.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. Glenn Surrey, CEO of Queenstown Airport. For us, one of the major challenges at Queenstown Airport is what happens outside the gateway to the airport itself. What we find is one of the most significant and pressing challenges, which sounds entirely consistent with our friends and colleagues in Aspen, is transport links, particularly roadways. And for us, it's between the airport and the CBD, which is a one-lane road each direction in and out of town with very limited options to be able to expand that road to create more capacity. So one of the opportunities that we see is how do we divert traffic or people out of cars between, and a lot of that is obviously visitors to our beautiful region, but also locals who are needing to get in and out of town for work. So one of the solutions that's actively being explored at the moment is how can we leverage a competency that we share in common with Aspen, and that's roadways and gondolas. And we are thinking about, is there an opportunity to create a public transport option and to create quite an extraordinary experience for people arriving into Queenstown and getting into town, which is where the bulk of the hotel accommodation is. And it's not just people getting to and from the airport. We're starting to see increasingly challenges with people wanting to get from their accommodation in town to the ski fields or out to other destinations across to beautiful Milford Sound. And that road linkage is becoming a real challenge for us. The great insight I had was when I started in this role in the midst of COVID, and we had a lockdown, and I drove out of the airport at 4:30 one afternoon and bumped into a traffic jam outside the airport where there was not a single plane flying. And I think that was a real aha moment for our community to understand that this is something we need to get on top of. Thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah, kia ora everyone, and thank you, Christine. Great to be on this. Look, I think the previous speakers have already touched on a range of other things, but from the area that I work in, electricity, just generally speaking in terms of infrastructure, I think small mountain towns and small communities generally struggle to some extent that they don't have access to the economies of scale that you get in much, much larger urban centres in terms of infrastructure. You can spread that cost across a wider customer base, but also you can achieve the resilience that comes through redundancy in those bigger cities. And when you're a town of 30,000 people, you don't have access to that kind of scale. And so you end up with all these choke points or congestion points in infrastructure. And Glenn's just talked about the transport system in Queenstown. In terms of the electrical infrastructure in Queenstown, I think we have one line coming in to the town, serving the entire town of 30,000 people, and we're almost 100% reliant on that line for our electricity needs. And so, and we are coming to the I guess the full capacity of that line. It's a 50-year-old asset, so the next step is a big chunk of cost, which we'll probably get to talk about a little bit more. But at the end of the day, you find yourself very much trading off the ambitions of the district to find more affordable ways to power homes and businesses and reduce carbon emissions, which 9 times out of 10 ends up with you electrifying something, being your car or the way you heat your home, the way you heat water, which drives up electricity demand, but that then potentially triggers a wave of infrastructure expenditure that may actually knock off many of those affordability benefits. So as a town, you're walking the line between doing the right thing for bringing down energy bills and delivering resilience, but at the same time, you're doing that very carefully to not overstimulate or over-trigger a set of infrastructure investments that ultimately the town will end up paying for. So walking that line, and as Cara articulated it beautifully before, in saying that you don't sort of get to choose one principle on which you base that. I think you inevitably find yourself trading off affordability, emissions reductions, equity, resilience, and trying to figure out what the right balance of those things is.
Thank you, Stephen. I wanted to pick up on the point about why we've linked transport and energy together. And it really was with a conversation with you, Stephen, that I really understood the extent of this. They're tightly connected. They've become so as we've progressed, but perhaps more so in the last decade. My question to the panel for all of you is quickly, how is that shaping the way you plan your infrastructure upgrades? And are you approaching things like fleet electrification, grid upgrades differently now? And I thought we'd start off again with Aspen, David and Cara, then Stephen and Glenn, before we move on to questions about affordability and resilience of this infrastructure. David.
Yeah, so on the transportation side, particularly the transit side, RAPTA has been deeply linked between energy and transportation since its founding. There's no way to really run, say, a mass transportation system and not be hyperly conscious of the cost of particularly gasoline and diesel historically, and increasingly electricity when it comes to, say, charging electric buses, and what are your demand charges and how does that fit into your service operating plan. So that is something that we are constantly looking at, is that linkage. For context, our fleet is currently about 140 buses. We only have 8 BEBs. We've got 50 compressed natural gas buses and 62 diesel buses, as well as 20 diesel and gas cutaways for paratransit and senior vans. So we've got a fairly diverse fleet now that we're continuing to diversify. We did pass a climate action plan in 2023 that dedicated us to reducing our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. We've got several strategies that we're using to do that. That includes electrifying our fleet, electrifying our facilities, as well as increasing transit ridership. So to do that, we're looking at transit signal priorities, expanding our bus rapid transit network or BRT, expanding our first last mile mobility services, and fare reductions. One of the things that we have coming up right now on the fare reduction side is we are looking at a 62-day experiment with free fare system-wide to see how that impacts our system, how many more riders we can attract, particularly those choice riders that might otherwise be in a single occupant vehicle. We're doing it on an experimental basis to see what our fare loss is, to see how we can recover from that, as well as what it means to our personnel and our bus infrastructure and whether we can accommodate that if we wanted to make it more long-term. So we are looking at purchasing 10 new battery electric buses here, taking delivery in 2026. We're particularly excited about those because they've got a 250-mile range that we can use system-wide, whereas our current ones are limited to the Aspen area. So because of their limited range primarily, but we're also going to be increasing our charging capacity for those vehicles, which does also mean electric grid infrastructure improvement. So we're finding ourselves in basically the electric grid market, which isn't typically our wheelhouse. So we're having to become experts in things that we haven't typically been experts in the past. And then long term, we're looking at moving over to the hydrogen fuel cells, but there are some other issues with that, particularly around finding commercially available hydrogen. So we've got a number of different pots in the fire to move this forward right now.
Excellent. Cara, would you like to elaborate a bit on your role?
Yeah, I think with David and RAFT as a partner, we're very fortunate to have a lot of the efforts that we are looking at in the transportation and transit is really through our partnership with RAFTA. But I might add to your question, Christine, on how we've been thinking about energy and transportation interconnected. For those that may not be aware, in 2018, we had the Lake Christine fire, and at that point, we were one power pole away from losing all electricity in Aspen on the 4th of July weekend. And I think that experience, as Sharon shared, unfortunately, when you are at the risk of about to lose your entire grid resiliency, it makes you start thinking about it differently. And I think what really opened our community's eyes was our energy transport is no different than our road transport. It still is one way in, one way out. And there's a high demand in the Upper Valley. And so if we don't build in that redundancy and other pathways to be thinking about it, then we're just as risk for our community about, kind of the long-term sustainability as we are if we think about it for our transportation systems. So some of the things that we've been looking at as we think about as in the aftermath of that event is we actually started to look at where those two are emerging. And what we found is that the airport, RAFTA, and our public service facility is the main way to evacuate people in an emergency. And if we're electrifying our airport, if we're electrifying our bus system, but we don't have the grid resilience to create that electrification, then we're no better off. And so we actually started looking at an integrated, what we're calling energy system around the airport, the RAFTA facility, and our public works department, so that we're also thinking not only where these two are integrated, but in the times of emergency, what we really need to be evacuating people out. So we've been in the process of building a microgrid that interconnects within our local utility, Holy Cross, as well as are starting to explore with the redevelopment of the airport, geothermal, and what opportunities there are, again, to build that energy resiliency right at those transportation hubs, because those two are so critical and interrelated for our community.
Sobering. Stephen.
Yeah, look, I'm not a transport expert. I'll hand to Glenn to talk about that, but I do think there's a huge opportunity here to think about electric vehicle charging from an electricity system perspective. The electric vehicle, it'll be the single biggest energy consuming device we add to the household and probably to most businesses. It will consume more power than most other things in the household. And at a mountain resort level, if you think about a tourism economy, what I do know about tourism economies, Queenstown's about somewhere between 60 and 65% economically or workforce reliant on tourism. The tourism economy is basically a system for moving people around, and Glenn's already alluded to some of the factors there. So if you go after electrified transport, then you've got to think about how and when am I going to be charging all those vehicles. David alluded to before, demand charges as a way in which we might influence that. But infrastructure is fundamentally driven by what happens at those peak times. So if we're thinking about how do we smartly avoid that wave of infrastructure build that'll be a cost that's placed on the towns, how are we influencing how and when households and businesses charge those vehicles and buses? How do we make sure that happens at a time that doesn't trigger that wave? And this is where smart charging of electric vehicles comes in, and us economists get very excited about, do you use pricing incentives to do this? Do we hand the controls of charging to another party in the electricity system and say, well, you figure out when it is? How do you make it easy for households and businesses to make that right decision, but also not feel like their autonomy to decide when they want to charge their vehicle and how much storage they want in the battery, that isn't taken away from them. So that I think is the nexus for me in terms of how these two systems, transport and energy, are going to come together very, very acutely and very tightly connected. It will be around the charging dimension.
Stephen, so Glenn, what's your perspective from running an international airport on a one-line grid coming in?
Yeah, I think, Christine, one of the challenges that we share, it seems, is this not only the one road in, one road out, but one cable in into our respective districts. And just from a resilience perspective, just to add to that, is for us is the seismic risk. We are in a very seismically active part of the world, and in an alpine environment with a high tension cable coming over tens of kilometres over mountains, that is very vulnerable in the event of a major seismic event. So one of the things we at the airport have been working with Stephen on is what local generation can we look to introduce at the airport. And of course, with the cost of land and locations like both Aspen and Queenstown, and there's not a lot of it that's available for building solar, what are those options? We do not have geothermal opportunities around where we are. So we are thinking deeply about that. We've had a huge emphasis on decarbonisation at the airport. We've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by some 80% by electrifying everything that moves and that we can at the airport. And so with that, of course, comes significant demand on the grid. And on a morning in winter when the ski resorts turn on their snow guns, there's a tremendous amount of demand on the electricity grid, and we're part of that. And as we continue to decarbonise and electrify, and that's before we even contemplate the idea of electric aircraft, if that comes to pass in the future, which will require rapid charging on a turnaround for them to be economically viable. So it's certainly a big challenge, and as Stephen said, we're working closely with the main national power grid operator to look at what we need to do to get extra electricity, another line into our district, because we're simply going to run into a capacity problem, I think, Stephen, at the end of this decade.
Fascinating. We're going to move on to infrastructure and resilient and affordable infrastructure. This is a question for Glenn and then David. So both towns are investing in major airport and town transport upgrades. And we wanted to look at what you're doing to improve access, reduce congestion, and keep things affordable, especially as demand grows. You've already mentioned you're looking beyond roads, and Glenn, we want to include air as we come into this as well. So over to you, Glenn. What are some of the major things you're working on?
Well, certainly one of the things any airport does, particularly when you have strong demand in a somewhat constrained environment, is looking at how you most efficiently spread that capacity across the time of the day. So we have a very significant master plan investment program that we've started on here at Queenstown. This is going to translate to circa $450 million of investment over the next 5 to 6 years. And one of the things we've done is introduce what we call slot control here at the airport, which most major airports globally operate. And that is where we try and de-peak or decongest the really busy times of the day, so that we're not building very expensive infrastructure just for the peak and then building peak on peak. So there's a tremendous amount of energy and effort going into that. We are working with our public transport providers. We've seen significant, about 80% increase in patronage on bus services to and from the airport over the last year, 18 months, which is very encouraging. But we are looking very deeply at how we can spread the load of activity that's happening at the airport and people coming to and from. But we're always going to have those peak, our international flights typically all arrive and depart early mid-afternoon, the way the airlines operate their schedules. So we've got some challenges there that we're working with all stakeholders on, see how we can spread that load to ensure that we're investing intelligently. Otherwise, we'll end up building a huge capacity just to try and cater to the peak.
Thank you, Glenn. David, what's happening in Aspen?
I think around here, it's important to recognize the context in which Aspen and the valley sit. So we are, for those of you who aren't familiar, we do have the Highway 82 corridor, which essentially connects all of the communities between Glenwood Springs and Aspen, which is about a 40-mile corridor. And then we've got another corridor that's within our service area that goes out to Rifle along the Interstate 40 or Interstate 70. That's another 40 miles. So within the Roaring Fork Valley, there's no ability to increase the size of the roads due to topography and limited land available for road expansions. In looking at RAFT's beginnings, we really started as a transit company to connect employers in Aspen and their jobs to employees and housing further down valley. And over time, that housing has continued to move farther and farther down valley. And RAFT has also taken on the means of not only being a transit company, but as a way to expand the capacity of the highway that we can't physically expand. So as a way to move more people more efficiently on a smaller infrastructure footprint, while at the same time continuing to connect those jobs to employees. So over those 80 miles that we serve, we are covering 11 different jurisdictions. So we're covering 8 different municipalities, and including Aspen. Aspen is one of them, as well as 3 different counties. And if you look at housing costs over that corridor, Glenwood Springs, which is right in the middle and at the junction of Highway 82 and I-70, used to be one of the more affordable locations. But currently, you can't get a single-family home in Glenwood Springs for less than $1 million, unless you're really hunting or get lucky. So as a result, our employee base continues to move further down valley along the 40-mile stretch along I-70. So we're seeing increasing pressure to extend our services beyond just the Roaring Fork Valley and down onto I-70 and really bolster our services into areas where we used to really just have more sporadic service. The cost of housing itself has hit us even as an employer. So now, we employ 385 employees roughly, and we have about 100 housing units, primarily in Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, and just a few in Aspen. We've actually ended up starting to move our housing out of Aspen and towards Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, because Glenwood Springs is becoming our focal point for our employees going forward. And still we have employees driving an hour and a half to 2 hours from Grand Junction and even farther to access our employment center in Glenwood Springs. So that us, like many other employers, are adding housing near the places where we need those employees. And that is effectively starting to act as another form of transportation, as a way of getting those employees closer to their employment centers because they have been priced out of those markets. So looking at the transit service itself, we have a challenge now of extending our bus rapid transit system beyond Glenwood Springs. It currently ends on the south side of Glenwood Springs and it goes 40 miles south to Aspen. We need to get it through Glenwood Springs so that we can connect to the I-70 corridor. And that means that we need to identify several miles of dedicated bus lanes through Glenwood Springs. And that means removing a lot of parking, possibly street trees, or utilizing a railroad corridor that we own for not just trails, but also for transit. So we happen to be lucky in that we own a railroad corridor. Not too many transportation authorities can say that they own an abandoned railroad corridor that can accommodate transit services. But we also need to incorporate the communities into that decision making. So we started down the road in 2020 of planning our connections through Glenwood Springs and expanding our bus rapid transit. That was cut short due to COVID. And then we received a Federal Highways Administration grant in 2025 for 2026, which is now frozen because the federal government has frozen transportation grants. So it's now, the demand continues, but the planning process is now stalled due to more national politics. So that goes back to the first question and how we're overcoming challenges. That is one of the challenges that we have on the national scene. We are also seeing, as a result of housing, increased interest in some of our communities in joining RAFTA. We're currently serving them through intergovernmental agreements. They would like more bolstered service, particularly as residents from the Roaring Fork Valley that are accustomed to having regular transit service no longer have it in their new communities and are now requesting it. So we're starting to see that dynamic creep up. So that could result in a closer relationship between RAFTA and some of our down valley communities that are primarily housing employees for the Upper Valley. We're also branching heavily out, as I mentioned earlier, into first last mile mobility programming. And this is primarily bike share and microtransit, and utilizing those as a connection to our trunk line service. So we passed a tax back in 2018 and specifically for bike share. And this year we're now expanded from Carbondale with our partner Recycle up to Aspen, and we had 261,000 rides on our bike share system that we partner with in 2024. And in 2025, we'll have 100 stations and 580 bikes on that system. That is free for users for up to 30 minutes. So really trying to encourage them to use it as that connection to our trunk line service. And then we've also rolled out a grant program incentivizing microtransit and amongst our member communities, as well as infrastructure that supports trails, trail development that also is critical to connecting people to transit.
Thanks, David. I'll just interrupt there. I think I'd like to pick up the issue of cost and constraints and move to Stephen and Cara. So electrification is obviously underway in both towns significantly, but those costs and constraints are real. How are you balancing ambition with affordability and grid resilience, particularly when space, funding, and terrain are very challenging? And if there are any funding models on the table, that public-private partnerships perhaps that you can highlight. Cara, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think this issue is becoming even more and more to a tipping point of how I think as we start to implement some of these projects and these code changes. So the other piece that Pitkin County has been doing is really looking at the built environment. So again, our houses, the residential aspects of Pitkin County, and looking at the building codes that really are creating some of these high demands for electricity or power, I should say, up in the Upper Valley section of our community. So one of the things that we've been looking at, for those of you that might not know, some of these homes are generating the same amount of power as some large-scale commercial buildings that are traditional in the United States. And so that amount of demand, we've started to talk about, when we think about electrification, we're also starting to talk about it in terms of intensity, kind of what Glenn was saying at the airport. We're saying it's the peak piece, but it's that intensity of how much is being needed and is driving up further and further demands for electrification. And so as that continues, we're also then having a push and pull of maintaining affordability within our community, right? Because we cannot apply some of these really big requirements to ensure, the greenest buildings and everything when we might be pricing out those long-term community members that can no longer afford to live here. So we've taken a couple different approaches. One is we are looking at, rather than being really aggressive on 100% electrification policy, especially of our new development, we are really evaluating, is there a certain threshold of home size based on some utility analysis that we're doing, that we're really seeing an exponential curve, and that we need to be looking at where are codes and carrots and sticks incentives applied to help to kind of understand that high-end demand of electricity while trying to not price out those that might not be using that same amount of demand on our grid. The other aspect, we're fortunate, it goes back to 2000, we created a renewable energy mitigation program. So for those that wanted to do more, especially as we talked about exterior energy, there was a mitigation fee that people could pay into it. This mitigation fee has basically been used at the county to allow lower income homes to apply energy efficiency measures. And so we're basically taking those that want to do more with their homes, that they're paying a fee to help bring the rest of the community up with them. So that has been a long-standing program. Now, as we're seeing kind of the elevation of what we need to do to address our climate goals, we're also looking at how can we elevate, what are we no longer willing to accept as a community, and where can we look at that mitigation program still benefit to help bring and maintain the affordability of the rest of the community. So that's one of the biggest pieces as we look at our policies that are out there, as we look at the programs that we're looking to implement. We have been very fortunate. We've been in an environment with federal and state funding that obviously has kind of shut the door for now, but one of the things we are still committed to is those opportunities come, and the reason we were able to build on those public-private partnerships and working with the state and the feds was that we were planned and ready to go when the opportunity came, and we don't want to stop that. So we want to continue the work. So when the funding comes again, the way to build those partnerships and continue the next round, we're looking at it with the airport and then many other of our projects so that we're ready when the funding is available.
Thank you, Cara. Stephen, does that resonate with our community here in Queenstown?
Yeah, look, definitely. And I guess as a starter, I don't necessarily see there is a conflict between ambition and affordability and grid resilience, I guess at a conceptual level, because today, look, as long as you can get it for a reasonable price and you don't get too overcharged by a solar installer, sticking solar panel on the roof and an affordable battery in the garage is probably the most affordable way for a household and a business to secure the next 10 or 15 years of its energy supply. It is lower cost. And that's the ambition. So when you electrify, if you do it with solar and batteries, you're probably going to pay less over the next 10 years than you would have otherwise. And from a resilience perspective, I really think this is something that is such a big mind shift for people to get their head around. If you compare it to vehicles fueled by petrol and diesel, or as the case is in Queenstown with heating, LPG, and even some absurd situations where diesel's still being used to heat homes, there is no kind of fuel refinery or oil well in the backyard, but you stick a solar panel on the roof and you'll capture sun every day and chuck it in the battery, and you could potentially keep a house going for a very long period of time in a seismic event. So there's a resilience win and there's an affordability win with the ambition. However, I think the critical thing is being touched on by Cara is how does that reach all members of the community, not just and I'm guessing 15 or 20% of the community that have $60,000 or $70,000 lying around to go and buy 1.8 electric vehicles or stick in a hot water heat pump or put solar and batteries. So we actually believe that finance is probably the key missing piece in New Zealand to enable that challenge of ambition and affordability to be managed. So how does, 30% of 40% of the district are probably going to be renters. Another 30% of us will have mortgages, but we've probably maxed out our mortgage to live in a place like Queenstown, and I suspect it's the same in Aspen as well, and which means you've only got this top end of income earners that have the cash lying around to do it. So how do you create the finance products that allow people to smooth that cost over the life of the solar panel or the battery, which will be lower cost even at 5 or 6% mortgage rate. But a lot of those, 60% of us probably don't have access to that kind of cash. So we're working with both local councils and actually councils nationally, but also talking to the big banks in New Zealand about how do you make those finance products available to people across a wider spectrum? How do you tap into landlords so that, you know, it's not the renter that has to worry about the affordability, but the landlord can put the panel on the roof. So those are kind of some of the initiatives we're looking at in the Queenstown context, but also, is there a role for, you know, Cara talked about the fund that was set up in 2000, I think you said, Cara, in Aspen. What's the role of some kind of community trust to maybe aggregate some of the benefits across wider scale solar and battery deployment and spread that out amongst the whole community rather than just being focused on those that can afford to make it happen?
Thanks, Stephen. I want to bring in now tourism. It's, brings both opportunity and pressure with it. And I'm going to go to you, Stephen and Cara, first for this one, because you've already touched upon how we keep systems affordable and these communities are livable or attractive for our workers and residents. But how do you balance these community needs with visitor demand? Perhaps Stephen and then Cara, and then we'll move on to you, David and Glenn, about some of the strategies that are working well to manage tourism.
Yeah, well, certainly the arguments could go on forever about how much of demand is being driven up by the visitor economy versus just households of people who are living here. And there will be plenty of debates and potentially ways we could think about pricing electricity into the future to do that separation. But on the worker front, I think that's a critical one where most of your tourism workers in Queenstown will be renting places, and it'll be potentially some lower quality housing stock, maybe in parts of the town which are it's very, very cold in winter, which I suspect will be the same in Aspen. So it goes back to that finance piece before, which I won't repeat all that. But how do we help landlords see the advantage in them investing? What benefits can we share with them investing in lower cost electricity in the form of solar? But that also applies to tourism businesses as well, because by and large in a hospitality dominated industry, restaurants, small and medium sized hotels, a lot of those properties are leased as well, and it's a little bit more challenging when you're only leasing a building or office space in a building to access things like solar and batteries in there, in terms of getting access to the right to do that. So that again is a conversation with landlords. And I think finally, as we move to a more electrified future, and if we can get electrified transport in there, how do we do affordable charging? And there's, I won't dive into the detail, but once you scratch beneath the level of just generic electric vehicle charging, there are decisions being made by charging infrastructure providers, which you question whether they're the right decisions for a community that, particularly for workers and renters, how do you make sure if they want to buy themselves an affordable electric vehicle to move around, how do they get access to affordable charging? So yeah, I think the renting worker dynamic is we've got some work to do on that.
Cara, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stephen hit it really well. We can debate it all day, but the truth of the matter is, when the fire happened or we had another gas outage, when people are in our community, it doesn't matter if you're a visitor, if you're a worker or a resident, it's our responsibility as part of the community to make sure everyone is safe and has their means to get to wherever they need to be. And so I think one of the pieces, as we really think about accessible and affordable, one of the things that we're really starting to look at is we've put a lot of infrastructure into the traditional commute work dynamics and visitor dynamics. You land at the airport and you're going to the city. That is all really important. I think it's the work that David and RAFTA and so many of our partners are doing. But one of the things I have an eye on is let's make sure that we aren't leaving people out. There's a huge portion of our workforce that are contractors and landscapers, and they have trucks, and those trucks are not going to be electrified. Those trucks are not sitting on the Highway 82 corridor. And so as we talk about affordability and accessibility in our transportation and our energy systems, let's make sure that we're talking about everyone, because not everyone is following the same paths. And if we keep leaving them out, then they won't be part of the solution to be really addressing it as we move forward.
Thank you. Now we're in the last 10 minutes before we move to the questions, and so please send them through the chat line so that we'll have them ready. So David and Glenn, I want to talk more about the opportunities and pressure from tourism, and what strategies have worked well or in the pipeline to sort of cope with the peak and congestion. So David, if you could start first, just for a minute or so, and then Glenn before we move to the final question.
Yeah, for sure. So clearly on the transit side, we participate daily in the movement of people into and out of Aspen and Snowmass Village that are not just tourists, but also working in the tourist industry. So we see a peak in winter, that is our high time, and then another peak in the summertime as a result of that tourist industry peaking. We also provide very specific services to tourists, so such as the Maroon Bell service. So we move about 300,000 visitors per year between June and October, just up to the Maroon Bells. We've got skier services between Aspen and Snowmass that are specific to the ski industry, as well as event-specific games such as the X Games. So those are ways that we plug in to try to mitigate that congestion pressure and reduce the need to actually expand the infrastructure to be able to accommodate it if all of those people were coming and going by automobile. We have seen a number of issues with that and strategies that have worked. A few strategies that we've seen work is free fares and reducing the friction on behalf of the customer, having low headway time so that a customer doesn't need to plan out a trip. They can simply show up and know that a bus will be there within 5 or 10 minutes, having developed and comfortable facilities, focusing on customer service, and our first last mile services again we've all found to be strategies that really help get people to that trunk line service. So we've actually seen capacity issues as a result of that. And you imagine on a regional service, we've got buses moving 55, 65 miles per hour down a highway. And if we've got standoos, then we potentially have safety issues. We certainly have comfort issues, and we also have reliability issues. So to a certain extent, we're a victim of our own success in a way. And yes, not everyone can take transit, but we find that a good portion of the community members can. And we're responding to that in a number of ways. We monitor capacity on buses. We have standby buses throughout the corridor to be able to respond and back up those services. And we're also actively working to reduce our headways during peak times. And this is the first time in 5 years that we've actually been fully staffed since COVID. So this is the first time that in 2026 is the first time that we've actually been able to consider tighter headways to be able to really address some of those capacity issues that we've seen and be able to move people in and out of the communities more efficiently.
David, Glenn, a lot happening at the airport. You've already talked a little bit about the efficiency, digital efficiency, smoothing the arrivals and departures and transits.
Yeah, so one of the big things we're actually doing is working with the airlines around most efficient deployment of capacity. So we have 4 airlines that fly into Queenstown. Interesting sort of fact is that New Zealand's a big tourism country. Over half of all inbound tourists from overseas that visit New Zealand will come to Queenstown on their itinerary. So we, get, immense numbers of people at peak times. And so we need to be able to manage that as efficiently as we can. And there are real peak seasons, very similar to what was described in Aspen, peak summer, peak winter periods of time. So we're working with the airlines as to particularly the introduction of A321neos. So those are the biggest planes that can fly into Queenstown. NEO stands for new engine options. So they're cleaner burning, less fuel, lower greenhouse gas emissions, really efficient aircraft, and they utilize less capacity. So we're working hard to do that, to make sure that we're squeezing the lemon as hard as we can around the efficiency of our infrastructure. But it's encouraging to hear from David and Cara what's happening in Aspen around ground transport. One of the issues we have is we don't have grants, federal grants, local government grants, or whatever. We basically have to make things work on a commercial footing, pretty much everything we do, and that includes energy. So we are having to think very carefully about how we can make these business cases stack up. But it's great to hear that when it's done well, it can really drive change, as appears to have been the case in Aspen. I think that's a model that we can aspire to and look at how we can do better, particularly in our public transport system here, both for residents, people who work in our community, and visitors alike.
Thank you, Glenn. So in closing, this is a question for each of the panel. If you could champion just one practical innovation in transport, energy, or in the community infrastructure that would make the biggest difference to your community over the next 10 years, what would it be? Perhaps we'll start off with Cara and David, followed by Stephen and Glenn.
I was hoping I wasn't going to be the first one to come up with it. There's so many, but the one that really pops out, one of the items that we're starting to look at as we've hit some thresholds within our built environment and really focusing in on that energy and grid reliance and knowing that we're one way in, one way out there, is how can we start to look at kind of these micro hubs of energy locations, and maybe not the traditional way as it looks within a utility, but how can a large home that might have a lot of solar also have battery too, and instead of it being a whole utility scale, it's a little community node of energy resiliency that is tapped into our utility, but also is serving 5, 10 clusters, whatever it might be. And it takes reframing and relooking at some of our regulations within the utility environment, how we think about solar regulations. But I think if we look at that, we can really start to build in a lot more grid resilience for our community.
Hey, David.
Well, I'm glad Cara went first. This may be kind of cheating, but I would say that it's really looking at expanded transit and trails infrastructure would really make a huge difference. We chip away at this all the time, but that really includes bus lanes, queue jumps at signals, transit signal priority, as well as use, in our specific case, the use of the Rio Grande corridor, our railroad corridor for transit purposes. But being able to expand that infrastructure and being able to give people safe options to get around besides an automobile, as well as removing transit from general traffic, I think can make a huge difference in the long term.
Thank you. Stephen.
Well, I'm annoyed that Cara went first because she kind of stole one of the ones I was going to talk about. So I'm gonna put some bets on Cara and her thinking about.
You got a feel for Glenn. He's last. So.
Yeah. So okay. So I've got to figure out how I get ahead of Glenn. But no, I'm going to dive into something there as my second option, a bit geeky, which we are looking at doing a trial later this year on, which is. Again, it's one of those things I don't think we've fully got our head around the potential scale of the energy storage devices you might have if we enable what's called vehicle to grid charging, which is rather than putting power into the battery of a vehicle, but how do I dynamically take it out of the battery in a vehicle as well? Because when you look at the size of a battery that sits in an average now commonly available electric vehicle, it's an order of magnitude more storage than the battery you stick in your garage when you go and order a Powerwall. So if you're going to have this huge scale increase in storage sitting in vehicles, what are the sensible ways you can take power in and out of that vehicle when the vehicle's dormant? And I'm thinking about, particularly in Glenn's situation, rental vehicles sitting dormant around the airport. Even when I park at the airport, I'm away for 3 days, my car's going to be sitting there dormant, not doing anything. Instead of paying the airport a large amount of money to park, maybe I could get a little bit of that back by having my battery used. And how do you work with customers to make that acceptable? I think it's a huge opportunity that's probably going to come to bear sometime in the next 10 years. And we're trying to look at ways to get an early indication of how customers might feel about that, how vehicle owners might feel about it, and what's the potential use by the system, working with the local network company on a trial around that.
Challenge for you, Glenn. Over to you.
I think for us, Christine, the big nut we have to crack is transport, surface transport around the district, both for people who live in Queenstown and the environs and visitors to the area. One of the real challenges we have to our social licence is that congestion, the fact that local residents are starting to avoid going into town because of the hassle with parking and just driving in and out. that's not a sustainable situation in the long term. So I think us looking at innovative options, certainly, mass transit on buses is one option, but as I said earlier, we've got limited rating infrastructure. So I really do think we need to look somewhat innovatively at how we can create what might be seen as novel public transport options. But you see it all around the world. When you get transport solutions working, big cities work. Now, we're not a big city. We have a lot of people here at peak times. But when you get that system working, it's livable and it's a good experience for visitors and residents. And that's really the issue I think we need to lean into quite assertively to try and solve. Otherwise, if we don't, I think one of the challenges we'll have is that our growing population in Queenstown is the fastest growing population in the country. It's a desirable place to live and people are voting with their feet and moving there. But with that comes pressure, and we need to look at innovative solutions to how we make that sustainable.
Thank you, each of you, for those insightful challenges. I think we've learned a lot. I wanted to move. We have one question, which will really, I think, be for you, Glenn, to answer, and it is exactly about novel transport initiatives. And it's from Jim Salinger, who was New Zealand's Person of the Year, a renowned climate scientist who lives locally in Queenstown. So we're really delighted to have you here in the audience, Jim. And your question is all about gondolas as a means of transport, and it has worked well in other places. And I know there's been a bit of talk about that in Queenstown. Glenn, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, and I guess nice to hear from you, Jim. This is something essentially I was tangentially referring to in my last response. I think that a gondola solution is an exciting potential option for Queenstown. One of the tricky bits is getting it from two main nodal points, one near the airport and one at the side of the CBD, feels like it's a solvable problem or opportunity. The really tricky bit is going to be, as David describes it, the last mile or the last half mile, getting from there to the hotel accommodation around the CBD and getting to the airport terminal to make it a really attractive solution for people carrying their skis or golf clubs or bikes. How do you make that work in a way that's going to get really good user acceptance? So I personally am very energized by it. I think it's an exciting opportunity, and I think it would make Queenstown an even more special place for people to visit, because just imagine the experience of getting off an aircraft in this beautiful environment, getting yourself onto a modern gondola, riding across the top of the mountains and dropping down into town, all as part of your experience of arriving or departing from our beautiful destination. I think it's very exciting, but there's a lot of work to do to bring it to fruition.
Please send your questions through, but I'd like to pick up the gondola issue. I know that Telluride has a magnificent gondola not that far from Aspen. David and Cara, is gondola an option at all, something that has been looked at in Aspen, Pitkin County?
I'm seeing which one of us is going first.
Okay, you go first, Cara.
I'll go first and David fill in the gaps. Yeah, so a gondola has definitely been a concept that's been floated around our county for, I don't know the amount of years. I'm gonna but as part of our congestion at the entrance to Aspen. But there's a couple different elements. I think Glenn hit on one, right? It's that last mile. It still is a preference piece. It's not going to solve all the aspects of it. And so I think our community has really struggled. To some of the conversation we've had before too, is that affordability piece, not just for the end user, but for the community as well. Is that the best solution? Is it really gonna move all the people that we're looking to move versus other investments that we could be looking at and need to be looking at for our aging infrastructure to help move everyone? And so I think that has been a long held debate in our community, and one of the other aspects that people really cherish about Aspen and Pitkin County when they land is this feeling of the rural and kind of wild areas. And so that visual impact, that floating the gondola across all the mountaintops is a point of tension for our community. And how does that impact our community's character?
Thank you. David, anything you wanted to add about novel transport? Perhaps there's something else on your horizon.
Well, the gondola piece is definitely a novel option. I do know that Telluride, as far as I know, they're the only system in Colorado, at least, that has a gondola as a part of their public transportation system. So it's actually run by the town for transportation purposes. I do believe that, at least in Aspen's case, looking at the speed of the gondola and the distance that it needs to cover is important. And there might be other technologies that might be more applicable depending on the climate and distance. So like an aerial tram versus a gondola, for instance, might be a better option. From our perspective, we're focused more on autonomous at this point. And I know that's been floated out there for a long time, but having autonomous buses, even if it's not serving the entire corridor, that could go a long way in for us to be able to get more service out on the road and more service to more people at a lower expense. So really bringing that cost down as well. So that's what we're looking at right now. We're also looking at it more regionally than I think would be feasible for, say, a gondola or aerial tram option.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then we'll bring it to a close. We haven't really talked about failures or lessons learned. And I wanted to ask each of the panelists if there was just one thing that perhaps you have worked on that didn't go as expected, and just briefly. So just lessons learned, word of advice for each other would be helpful. Perhaps Glenn, would you like to start?
I think as an airport, we had a very, very salutary lesson about 5 or 6 years ago, where the organisation, we got over our skis a little bit in terms of our growth aspirations and the engagement with the community, and we got out of step. And really, I think, in the last 4 years I've been in the role here at Queenstown Airport, we've worked very hard to build consensus and alignment with all stakeholders, from Sharon and the team and all of the members of the Business Chamber of Commerce through to residents and all stakeholders that have an opinion about the visitor economy, to make sure that we walking at the same pace as what the community's aspiration and acceptance and tolerances of visitor numbers and just activity. And so we've worked very hard, and we continue to work very hard. We don't get it right all the time, and that's probably an impossible task, but we're really focused on making sure that we maintain, this idea of social license, which we take extremely seriously, so that we understand what it is that our community is prepared to support. And we have our vision for the airport is to be an innovative airport that people love to travel through and that the community takes pride in. And that last one's really important, maintaining that community pride and acceptance and support for what we do. And that's been our biggest learning, I think, Christine, is really placing that right at the forefront of everything we do and trying to maintain that balance.
Thank you for being so candid with that. Stephen, have you got anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, look, the reflection I was having there is an interesting question, Christine, that took me a bit to get my head around. I think I spent 3 years in local government a few years ago, particularly around the COVID thing. And it was over that period around COVID and just before council where I think you start seeing the potential future for the district and what it might mean in terms of electricity demand and the way that might deal with affordability and resilience, earthquake, seismic resilience. And it was very frustrating to feel like you weren't getting the attention of the traditional supply side of the power industry to get the head around that. And that's a part of the system I've been part of for 25 or 30 years. So I kind of was quite frustrated by that. And I think it's very easy and I did, and sometimes we as council did also dive into a very negative framing about, sky's going to fall on our head, we're going to run out of power, the line's going to come down in an earthquake, and you guys aren't really stepping up to the plate, the supply side of the industry, network companies. But you very quickly realize that the negative framing doesn't engender the fact that you need to partner with these people to actually get the solutions along the line. And I think we still wrestle with that balance today, but I think working with particularly local network company and also the National Grid company, it's got to be a positively framed partnership, that there's an opportunity here to do something quite special in a special part of not only the country, but a special part of the world like Aspen, where we could actually demonstrate the best way to build the sort of the 2040 energy system, but do it really quickly and do it by 2030. So I think being better at that dance about how you frame things as opportunities rather than just a series of threats that can get pretty depressing quite quickly, I think is the big learning I'd take out of that.
Good. Cara, and then David to close.
Yeah, some ways as I reflect, I can agree with a lot of what's being said and shared a lot of practical, but I think as I reflect, one of the lessons or ideas I would share is a lot of the work that we're doing, we would not be doing if it wasn't leaning into our community, kind of going where Glenn was, and leaning onto the ideas and the creativity of the community. I think of the airport visioning process that really started to lead towards how bold we wanted to be with our terminal, where we want to think about our transportation systems off of the airport, that we're now starting to move into implementation. If we would have just relied on ourselves and some consultants, I don't know if we would have had the same creativity that we got from running a very robust public process. Same thing as we look at, our Vision 2050 piece, we did that by bringing in our community, and I can tell you they came up with ideas. The community node concept on private property was not something that was on any of our radars, and it only took that collective dialogue. So it takes a lot of work. Not every solution is there, but I really hear what Stephen's saying is we're in a place that we can advance this and maybe make that 2040 become, I'm going to go with 2035 reality, but that, let's leaning on the creativity in our community, because there's a lot of phenomenal ideas out there to think about how to do things a little bit differently and being able to put that into practice here.
David.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. And I would say that something that I've learned over the years is that everything is interconnected. So everything's a system, and that trying to approach a problem with a siloed approach just leads to failure at the end of the day. So you have to include the community for sure, and being out of step with the community, we have found is the surest way to doom a project or an effort. But at the same time, including all stakeholders within your organization and all members, and trying to include all technological solutions that might be out there, even if they're not quite mainstream yet. So really trying to take that systemic approach and realizing that everything hits everything else.
Excellent. Well, I want to bring this to a close. It's been an excellent conversation, and I really have to thank our panelists for your thoughtful and candid comments. In fact, that's one of the feedback that we've been getting, is that people really appreciate the honesty and the openness of these conversations. A lot comes out of them, and that our hope is that our communities, through this collaboration across borders, we can build a more resilient and better connected mountain towns that we all enjoy living in. So with that, I'd like you to also thank our partners and audience. It's a pleasure to have you on board, and we'd like you to keep an eye out for the next Sister City Challenge Forum, which we're planning for in September. And if you're in Queenstown and you want to keep this conversation going, the Electrify Queenstown Forum is coming up at the end of the month, and we'd love to see you there. So thank you, everyone, and have an enjoyable evening or rest of the day.